I was asked to talk a bit about PISA, but I'd like to broaden the conversation a little bit and talk more generally about large-scale international assessments, and particularly about the growth and innovation in them. So what I'd like to do is kind of, in the time that we have, is kind of take you through this agenda. I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of a historical context for large-scale assessments, where they started and how they've evolved. Talk a little bit about the growth in them, and then talk about some of the features of large-scale assessments, because they differ significantly from individual psychological testing. Talk a little bit about the growing importance of computer-based assessments. I actually think that's the future, and that's where everyone's headed. I'll talk a little bit about recent innovations, and here I want to talk about some innovations in PIAC and also in PISA. ETS, which is where I'm from, is now responsible for both PIAC and the consortium for PISA. And so they share a lot of similarities from a methodological and technical point of view. So I think it would be useful for us to talk a little bit about those innovations. And then I'll say a few words about where I see the future going from a research and methodological perspective. I hope this won't take the full time, and that there'll be lots of opportunity for a conversation. If there's something I say while I'm presenting that you don't understand or disagree with, feel free to ask a question or to ask for clarification. I would rather this be more of a conversation than a lecture. And I have a tendency to speak quickly, so if I'm speaking too fast, you can ask me to slow down. I'm not offended at all. Okay, so just to begin, I think large-scale assessments that we're going to talk about is a relatively recent innovation. It's only been since the late 50s, early 60s that these kinds of surveys have been around. Before that, I would argue, at least in the literature that I've looked at, there wasn't much systematic collection of educational data, particularly on the process or output of education. In 1958, a group of scholars got together at the UNESCO headquarters in Hamburg, Germany, to talk about issues surrounding the evaluation of schools and students through systematic collection of data around skills and attitudes and knowledge. That meeting led to a feasibility study of 13-year-olds in 12 countries, and that led to the legal entity that you now know of as IEA. In the United States, around the same period in time, our Minister of Education was called at the time a Commissioner of Education. His name was Francis Keppel, and he invited a rather well-known university professor by the name of Ralph Tyler to develop a plan for the periodic assessment of student learning. He was concerned that there was no data at the national level in the United States for looking at what happens in schools or for looking at outcomes. Most of the data that were collected in the United States at that time was really input data. How many school buildings there were, how many classrooms, how many kids were going to school, but nobody knew anything about what was happening in the classroom or whether or not kids were actually learning. The reason that he picked Ralph Tyler is that Ralph Tyler had developed a reputation and a set of knowledge around what schools should be teaching around curriculum evaluation. He wrote one of the first books on curriculum evaluation and was really concerned with how do you begin to measure not what kids' abilities are in the traditional psychological sense, but what it is kids are learning as a result of going to school. They held some planning meetings in the early 60s. These were funded by the Carnegie Foundation, if you know about them. And then in 1969, NAEP, which is our national assessment, NAEP stands for National Assessment of Educational Progress, first assessed in school 17-year-olds in these three areas. So Tyler's vision was that NAEP would focus not on individuals, but would focus on groups of students, to be able to report how groups of students were doing, what they know, and how they were performing on some key areas that he thought were important, rather than looking at individual outcomes. So this started to think about and change the perspective from looking at individual scores to now looking at what we would call, for large-scale assessments, group scores. So his notion was the assessment would be based on identified objectives, and those specifications would be determined by subject matter experts. So if you think back to that period in time, the idea was around that people believed that you could measure in a single objective, a single skill, or a single piece of knowledge. I think cognitive psychologists no longer think that that view is quite useful, but at the time that was sort of state of the art. And he believed that reports could be based on the performance of selected groups and not individuals who responded correctly to exercises and would not rely on grade level norms. So he was moving away from sort of the norm reference testing, the classical test theory, to start thinking about, well, how can we identify objectives that would be important to different domains in a school-based model, and how students as a group would do on those as a measure of the efficiency and effectiveness of schools. So prior to IEA and NAEP, there were no assessment programs to measure students or adults as a group, either in the United States or internationally that I'm aware of. At the time, as I said, the primary focus of educational testing had been on measuring individual differences. It came out of a psychological sort of model about individual differences and the distribution of ability in a normative way. The data that were collected dealt primarily with inputs to education rather than the process and outputs. So that the beginning of NAEP and IEA really marked a change in perspective in terms of the kinds of questions that people were asking. The problem was that using that kind of a model in the classical test theory, interpretations are really limited to the set of items used in the assessment. So if you look at classical test theory, it's really good for creating a total score. It's not particularly good for creating a scale that allows you to make inferences beyond the set of items or beyond the people that were taking those items. But the approach that IEA and that Ralph Tyler and others developed in the 60s really stayed in effect through most of the 70s. In 1980s, we saw a real shift in the methodology around large-scale assessments. There was a paper or a monograph written actually at ETS by three relatively important people in the field of measurement. A guy named Sam Messick, who's I think best known for his work on validity. A guy named Fred Lord, who's best known for his work in developing the theory of item response theory, and Al Beaton. The three of them wrote a monograph called A New Design for a New Era. This was part of the proposal that ETS wrote to bring NAEP to ETS from the Education Commission of the States, where it had been since its founding in the 60s. They actually began by arguing that the work that had been done in the past really was limited from a policy perspective, because you couldn't create a scale, you couldn't link the scales to background information. So the models that had been in place in the 70s were quite limited from the point of view of policymakers. And policymakers, by the time the 80s rolled around, were critical of NAEP because it wasn't addressing the kinds of policy questions that they were most interested in. So this move to ETS and the introduction of IRT and other methodological innovations really shifted, I think, the way in which these large-scale group score assessments were done, and put them on a trajectory for growth and innovation. So the new methodology around the IRT involved marginal estimation to estimate or to optimize the reporting of proficiency distributions. It allowed for more complex designs like balanced and complete design, or BIB spiraling that they call it. And that basic approach is still in use today. So one of the challenges that large-scale assessments had back then was that you have a constraint whether you're in a school, in a classroom, or even if you're going to adults in the homes. You have a limited amount of time. Yet everyone knows, all domain experts will tell you, that you can't measure a whole construct in an hour. And so what this methodology allowed people to do was to look at the construct in its entirety, build a much larger pool of items than any one person could take. So the BIB spiraling allowed individuals to take a subset of the items, but by the way in which it was organized and the covariance information you got and the models that were built, you could actually estimate what they had done on the full set. And then by linking that to background information, you were able to provide policymakers with a much richer set of data, and you could begin to look at trends and other things. So that really changed the nature of large-scale assessment. So that, I think, the 80s marks sort of what I would call the beginning of a second period. You know, in the 50s and 60s was sort of the initiation of these large-scale assessments. The basic model stayed in place for a decade or more. And then the 80s saw a real shift in the methodology that I think really changed sort of the face of large-scale assessments.